Chapter 16, Dancing with Honor. Rener Calo. If there was anything I admired about the Emperor, it was that he was fearless. If there was a fight, he would lead us. He was never one to cower. And now, the Emperor ran ahead of us, into the palace yards, towards the death tents. The gods only knew what awaited us there. When we reached the tents, the soldiers shouted and rallied. But there was nothing to be seen. Nothing to fight. I felt like an idiot. Search the grounds. The Emperor shouted. I looked back at my men and asked them to divide. We had to cover the grounds that were littered with hundreds of death tents. But it was ridiculous because there was nothing to fight. There was no movement. Nothing. Then I heard a soldier scream inside one of the death tents. I scurried over, and when I got there, 3 soldiers were walking away. Elos is dead, a soldier muttered. War dog's gone crazy. The ghosts must have possessed him. I stared at them, confused. How could the war dogs fight us? They were trained to sniff out and attack the enemies and not the palace soldiers. I moved around and continued running, searching for ghosts. Were there really ghosts? When I got to the other end of the palace yards, there was nothing to see. There was no movement. There were no sounds except for the shouts the soldiers were making. Everyone must have been as confused as I was. In the middle of the yard, between the gaps of the pitched tents, soldiers were swinging their swords to nothing but air. It was almost hilarious. Then the clouds gathered, and lightning split the sky until the ground erupted as bolts hit it. There was no way the Emperor would let this trespass go unpunished. If at all, it was a fitting counter to the attack. When something is unseen, you have to attack randomly and catch the enemy off guard. I ran back, dodging lightning and carefully treading past the other soldiers. When I got closer to the Emperor, I saw war dogs leap at him. A furry gray one with eyes that were as dark as pitch bit the Emperor's cape and pulled him downwards. Astonished, the Emperor raised his hands and shielded his body. Another war dog charged, snarling. Its monstrous mouth bared and bit at the Emperor's neck. As though washed over, my surprise was taken over by an urge to kill, and I danced, wielding my sword against the gray one and slit its neck. Then I pierced its body over and over with my sword. To my right, another soldier had taken care of the other war dog. Blood spilled on the ground and started pooling around their broken bodies. Another war dog leapt forward, tearing at the soldier. The soldier shrieked as its fangs landed on his neck. He squirmed, flailing helplessly, but to no avail. I jumped at the dog and ended its life. Get help! I shouted. The Emperor's fallen. A bunch of soldiers who were not being attacked by the war dogs came in a rush and lifted the Emperor, who had already passed out. The Emperor's blood trailed after the soldiers, and I wondered if the Emperor would survive. I danced and swung my sword repeatedly. Each slash landed with a loud thud against the dogs, sending them toppling over. It was true. The war dogs had gone crazy. The last of them had fallen, but I swung again in frustration while holding out a scream. It was a failure among the war generals to have the Emperor hurt. It was not supposed to happen. The shame would be too much for each of us to bear. I froze. When I swung, it felt as though I had hit someone. But there was nobody around. I looked around me, squinting. How will I see the ghosts? How can I fight them without seeing them? I closed my eyes and tried to sense them. There was a slight movement to my right. Amidst the ruckus, I heard the silent footsteps of someone as though whoever it belonged to was floating. Then I opened my eyes quickly and thrust. I gazed in horror as my sword pierced something in the air. I swear, if I released my hold on the sword, it would not have fallen to the ground as though something solid was gripping my sword. I twisted the hilt until I felt flesh tearing. Blood oozed out and dropped to the ground. Right before my eyes, a body materialized. The man had gray skin. His eyes were wide open, and his jaw dropped in astonishment as a realization hit him that he was about to die. I chilled. The ghosts were real. Keep swinging your swords. The ghosts are nearby. I don't know how many, but fight them. Make them fall. Avenge the Emperor. I shouted. All around me, the soldiers did as they were told. But it was difficult to fight something unseen. I had been lucky. I turned around, and my face was thrown back by the force of a powerful blow. I lost balance and fell, but I was trained to fight. In a quick movement, I was up again, more aware of the surroundings. But another punch landed against the back of my head. I swung around, desperate to kill whoever it was that was fighting me. Some soldiers fell as swords hit them from nowhere. The cries filled the air as soldiers fell to the ground, and I felt cheated at the way the war was being fought. Cowards! I yelled in anger. Fight us equally. You have no honor. But there was nothing to be seen. To my front, I saw an old man running, clutching a sword in both hands. He swung the sword against Nolan, a young soldier who had not seen a lot of fighting. He fell down, clutching at his stomach. His intestines had started to pour forth blood and organs in a ghastly torrent to the ground. He yelped at the horror, and I felt for him. It was not how a war should be fought. Through all of this, it was a coward's fight, and we stood no chance of winning. A soldier fought against the old man, but even the elders seemed to be flying. He met each slash with a slash, and it was an even match. I ran towards the old man. The Emperor fell, but not all soldiers would. Before I could come closer, a sword hit me on my left side, and I felt a searing pain. I turned sideways, flailing my sword at nothing but air. You have no honor. I shouted as I swung the sword heavily, yearning for it to hit something. I stumbled as I lost my balance when my sword met nothing but air. 100 soldiers were fighting nothing, arms stretched out, holding tightly against their swords. Brass armor glinted in the early rays of the sun, but everything seemed like a parody when each of us danced, and no enemy was to be found. Show yourselves. Fight us equally on this land. I shouted in frustration as my side continued to burn. Blood was already dripping from it. The old man fell, and Mandy thrust the sword at him. Wait! I shouted. Mandy stopped and waited for my instructions. I ran towards them and pointed my sword at the elder. This man would die if you do not show yourselves. Fight us equally. There is no place for you if you cannot fight us levelly in Canella. I looked around, searching for movements. The palace soldiers went still, sensing their surroundings. There is no place for us, a deep voice said a few yards away from me. Then a body showed. He was bald, and his skin was gray over a sinewy frame. The Canellan palace has forgotten us. All around us, men started appearing. They looked the same, at least as far as their skin coloring was. My grip tightened on the sword, and I pulled the elder to his feet. Fight us on level ground. 1 against 1. Give me a sword, and I will fight you here. He said. And let the elder go. The old man twisted under my hold. Andoni, don't. He is a war general. He will butcher you with his sword before you can even bend to pick one up. The man called Andoni had his gaze fixed upon my face. All the other men with him stood ready to fight, but not one among them moved. It surprised me to count only a handful of them. And yet, they fought like they were hundreds. Dead soldiers lay sprawled on the ground, and only a couple of grayish bodies had fallen. Release him, Andoni said. And I will fight you the way soldiers were intended to fight. I pushed at the elder, who was immediately assisted by 2 grayish men. I motioned to one of the soldiers to give his sword to Andoni. The man was not wearing any armor, nothing but his clothes. If I were to die honorably, protocol dictated that I remove the armor I was wearing too. One by one, I removed all the metal protecting my body, starting with the helmet. My soldiers watched in silence as I did. This is how to fight honorably. I yelled at them. Then once I was wearing nothing but my clothes, I moved around, urging Andoni to fight. He moved closer, knees bent, eyes watchful as an eagle's, his right hand holding the sword in an almost awkward fashion. Then he moved towards me so speedily that I could only block the sword and failed to swing back. He seemed to be unaccustomed to using the sword and yet surprised me as he wields one with equal expertise as me. "If I die, release my body to my people," he said, his eyes burning hot like coals. I squinted at him, oblivious of the sweat that was dripping from my forehead to my eyes. "When you die, your body will be fed to the carrion eaters," I said. I dipped and rotated, then stepped backward in a deft move, and at the last second thrust out my sword, but he was quick, and our swords clashed in mid-air. But it was an ancient step, a simulated attack to make the enemy open to an offense. And so, I pushed the sword deeper and swung, hitting Andoni on his left leg. He yelled and fumbled, but he was back on his feet again. His face was still devoid of fear. "We're equal now," I thought, as the wound on my side burned. "Show that you have honor in as much as you claimed. Should I die, release my body to my people to be buried." Andoni shouted. He swung his sword, and I jumped back. Then I rolled to the ground, rose up, and with a quick jerk to my right, thrust the sword towards his ribs. The blade barely touched his chest as he jumped back. He was fast. His movements were so graceful that it was as if he were dancing. "Never. For attacking the palace, for cheating us with your power, you will not get a decent funeral," I yelled. Our swords clashed, each slash making us more tired and impatient about how this fight would end. But no one had ever bested me in swords, and this man would not be the first. So, I swung my right hand, slashing against him. In a fluid movement, I passed the sword to my left hand and thrust the pointed blade against his chest, piercing Andoni right between his ribs. The sword he was holding fell to the ground, clanging amidst the gasps of everyone. The elder groaned as though it was he who had been stabbed. Andoni slowly sagged to the ground, his hands upon my sword as though he could prevent it from killing him. His eyes had gone wide. Then everything happened so fast. The gray men disappeared into thin air. Someone clobbered me, and I fell, releasing my hold on the sword. Right before Andoni vanished in thin air, I watched as he pulled the sword closer to his body until only the hilt showed on his chest. A wise move if he wanted to stop blood from gushing out. "Rise! Search for them! They can't escape!" I yelled. The soldiers took up their swords and frantically slashed at the air, hoping that they would catch the gray men with their movements. The elder was gone too. "To the gates! Seal the gates! Don't let anyone escape!" I shouted. A loud sound came from behind us, and I gasped as war dogs bare their fangs on us. One by one, they leapt at us, and we had to fight to prevent our limbs from being torn away from our bodies. When the last of the war dogs lay whimpering atop the bodies of fallen Canellan soldiers, I looked at the faces of my men. Then I stared in horror at the open gates. No one among us was able to raise the alarm for the soldiers in the entrances to close them. "We will not let them loose. After them!" I shouted. Then I grabbed my horse, and the soldiers rallied after me. The other war generals were moving towards the gates. "What makes you think we'll get to capture them?" Benno Tabol asked. The muscular war general of Amer rode beside me. His face wore a quiet determination. "The gods have never favored cheats in the past," I said with burning rage. Then we rallied to the gates. We climbed on the horses and rode. I kicked at my horse, urging it to go faster. I saw several war generals do the same, all of us determined to capture the intruders. But a mile away from the gates, my horse slowed down until it stopped entirely. I kicked at it, angry at it for keeping still. "Ride, you stubborn beast!" I yelled. I kicked hard and tugged at the reins, but my horse Maya did not move. I looked around me in astonishment. All of us were riding on our bays, but none of them was moving. "The horses won't budge, General," the soldiers kept on saying. "Well, make them!" I yelled back, frustrated. I kicked my horse many times. Then, as though the horse had grown courage, it started to gallop, then it reared up, its forefeet up in the air. I gripped the reins tightly so I would not fall down. The other soldiers did not have much luck, and I watched as they toppled to the ground one after the other. Benno Tabol was seething as much as the next war general. The horses had gone crazy too. The ghosts had somehow, I did not want to think it, cast a spell on the horses, making them disobey their master's command. When no other soldier remained seated on his mount, the horses stopped their mad galloping. I looked at the far road ahead, wondering where the ghosts were now and how long before any of us could capture them. But the man called Andoni would not survive the day. At least with that, I had been successful.